Now this is hype. Hype, hype, hype. No, seriously, that's what it says on the box here. Hey everybody, my name is Caleb, also known as FC Construct, and today I will be reviewing the Thieaudio Hype 2, Hype 4, and Hype 10. So the Hype series is Thieaudio's newest lineup of IEMs, and they claim that it's, the combination of everything that they've learned through making IEMs. Now what's interesting about these three is that they all use the same two dynamic drivers placed in isobaric configuration in order to provide the bass response. They only differ in the number of balanced armatures they have. So for example, the Thieaudio Hype 2 has 2 BAs for $300, the Thieaudio Hype 4 has 4 BAs for $400, and the Thieaudio Hype 10 has 10 BAs for $800. So really quickly for accessories, you get this large Thieaudio zippered case, you get some white silicone tips in small, medium, and large sizes, and you get some black foam tips as well. They also include some random accessories like a cleaning cloth and cable tie. For cables, the Hype 2 comes with this silver cable, the Hype 4 comes with this brown cable, it's actually pretty nice, and the Hype 10 comes with the same cable as the Thieaudio Monarch Mark III, which has these interchangeable terminations, which is a nice little value add. So I hear a lot of complaints nowadays about the size of IEMs, that they're getting way too big, and I completely agree. They are ridiculous, and unfortunately these IEMs are no different, so here's your disclaimer. The Hype 2 is the smallest of them all, but it's still getting to be a bit bulky. The Hype 4 is definitely bulky, it's like 10% larger, and the Hype 10 is another 10% larger or something like that. It is large, okay? No question about it. In my ears, these IEMs are okay. The Hype 2 is alright, I start to feel it with the Hype 4, and the Hype 10 is seriously chunky. The nozzle size is 6.3mm, so it is pretty big, but the good news here is that it's just large, no sharp edges or anything like that, so I was able to have them in for a couple hours without having too much issue. I would say my ears can fit more than most people, so I don't really have an issue, but once again, this is your disclaimer. I warned you. So now let's take a look at the frequency response of these IEMs to get an objective measure of what they might sound like. So notice how all three IEMs fall largely within the gray region here. As a reminder, these graphs are calibrated to the diffuse field HRTF, which is the anatomical baseline compensation needed for headphones and IEMs, which is why it's a calibration, not a compensated curve, which is to whatever target you want it to be. Now the important point here is that with the wide bands here, they represent the amount of tonal deviation or tonal color a headphone could have without starting to be perceived as imbalance, according to Listen research. So you'll notice that I'm specifically not talking about the DF plus 10 decibel slope here. That's because it's a crude approximation of what the preference bounds already show us. So in other words, because these Hype IEMs fall largely within the gray region here, you're probably not going to find them to sound particularly wrong in any way, but rather they're going to be more like different shades of right or different flavors of balanced. Now of course that's just some graph reading here. Let's talk about my subjective experience. Now I mentioned that these Hype IEMs use Thieaudio's newest impact squared drivers for the bass. In my opinion, they are okay. On the upside is that the transient attack speed or length of decay is good. There's no issues there. There's a great balance between the boom and the punch of this IEM. It blends those two seamlessly. So neither one really dominates. It has a good overall tonal profile. And if we look at the tuning on the graph here, we can see that it has a north of neutral tuning, so it's heard without being too bassy. Now unfortunately, the problem I have with the bass here is that there's a weird sort of hollowness to the sound. It's as if the isobaric drivers are not being able to breathe properly and they're somehow stifled. This is most apparent with the Hype 2 and the Hype 4, where the Hype 4 is actually, I would say, the most leanest of these three IEMs, and there's not as much depth to the bass as to what the frequency response might suggest. The Hype 10 is okay here actually, and I presume it's because having those extra balanced armatures is somehow supplementing it with giving it more richness and weight and impact to the notes. As such, in terms of bass definition and layering, I would say that it does improve from the Hype 2 to the 4 to the 10, though it is in somewhat minor increments here. It's not going to be a night and day difference. And finally, in terms of bass dynamics, I would say these IEMs are more of a function of volume rather than true explosive dynamic swings. Alright, so now on to the mid-range. As we can see from the frequency response graphs, we can expect the mid-range of each three to sound, pretty good. And hearing them in isolation, I would say they range from good to great. But having them side by side to compare, and especially when I'm volume matching them, a clear winner comes out for me, and that is the Thieaudio Hype 4. It's just really good. It makes male and female vocals feel effortless, and there's just a slight amount of forwardness to them, so it makes these vocals stand out from the rest of the mix. In comparison, the Hype 10, as you can see on the graphs here, have what I would call a bit of a vocal front around the 2 kHz mark, while the Hype 2 has a sort of weird timbral awkwardness to it that I can't quite put my finger on. Now outside of vocal performance, I do think there will be some who prefer the Hype 10's mid-range. I find that it enhances the tone of certain instruments like the electric guitars, and I kind of go back and forth between the Hype 4 and the Hype 10 on which I prefer for instrumental tracks. Like the bass, the Hype 10 has a little bit of an added richness and depth to its sound that makes it a little bit more pleasant to listen to compared to the Hype 4's timbre, which I can describe as a little bit dry sounding. Now obviously this is all highly subjective. Specifically for some piano tracks, I do prefer the Hype 4's slightly cooler tonality because I find it more accurate for that performance. Now the Hype 2 on the other hand, it sounds good at first listen, but on top of some of that timbral awkwardness that you start to hear a little bit more as you listen to it, there is also some sort of strange mid-range compression going on, so I just tend to prefer the Hype 4 and the Hype 10. Now the treble is where these three IEMs really start to diverge. For the Hype 2, it's characterized by having significantly more low and mid treble elevation, and that emphasizes the upper harmonics of certain instruments like the snare drum, where the crack and pop is significantly more pronounced than the Hype 4 and the Hype 10. Similarly, the initial attack of hats and cymbals are pushed forward, while the trailing ends of tones are slightly left behind due to that contrast in treble elevation and tuning. Now for the Hype 4, I would say it's more the upper treble that's an issue for me. The best way I would describe it is as if a mixing engineer turned up the faders for the hats and cymbals just to sort of hear what they're doing in the track, and then forgot to turn them down. They just sit constantly on top of a mix, and it can be a little bit annoying when you notice it and you hear it all the time. The thing for me is that it's not even that sibilant or harsh or fatiguing. I wouldn't even call it like super bright. It's just exaggerated in a way it doesn't really need to be. Beyond that, I do think that the treble of the Hype 4 is actually quite good. It's vibrant, it's coherent, it has a nice control, and for the most part, there's a really nice balance across the entirety of the note. All it needs is just a touch of EQ to bring down the upper treble exaggeration, and then you're golden. Now for the Hype 10, its treble is actually very similar to that of the Hype 4 with a lot of the same characteristics that I enjoyed, but doesn't have quite as much exaggeration and is a little bit more smoothed over. It's what the treble of the Hype 4 should have been. No EQ needed. Though interestingly, there is a little bit of shimmer and sizzle to the hats and cymbals of the Hype 10, so it gives those instruments a little bit of character. Alright, so now moving on, let's talk about the technical performance of these IEMs, or what I like to call the overall presentation. For the Hype 4 and the Hype 10, I would say both of these IEMs have respectable resolution, but I would say they do it in different ways. The Hype 4 is all about articulation. Notes are very well defined on this IEM, though they can sound a little bit dry like I previously mentioned. With the Hype 10, it's more about hearing those hidden notes that I typically don't notice. Layering is its strong point here, especially in the bass. And for that reason, I do prefer the Hype 10's presentation of resolution over the Hype 4's. The Hype 2, on the other hand, holds its own for the price bracket, but doesn't really impress in the grand scheme of things. For soundstage, all three of these IEMs are pretty much equal. It's on par with most decent IEMs, it's nothing out of the ordinary. In terms of imaging, the Hype 10 is better in terms of layering and depth compared to the Hype 4, which is also in turn better than the Hype 2. Dynamically, it's a similar story. These IEMs don't really have the best dynamics. The Hype 2 is notably poor in the mid-range. The Hype 4 is okay. The Hype 10 is just a touch better, but overall it's just, kind of middling. And honestly, I don't really knock any of these IEMs for that. It takes a very exceptional IEM to have great dynamics. These are okay. Alright, so let's talk about some comparisons. At $300, the first IEM that comes to my mind is the MoonDrop Blessing 3. I know that this IEM can be a bit too aggressive for some people, and a lot of people are waiting on Critical's version of it. But personally, I find that whatever we have here already is actually a very strong contender. This IEM has a very punchy mid-bass, it has resolution that is just about as good as anything you can get under $1,000, and the treble, while it is bright, I find that it is brilliant without taking away the essence of the notes. I really appreciate the bright and forward sound of the Blessing 3 because it gives it a bit of character that you don't find in a lot of IEMs nowadays. Now compared to the Hype 2, I would take the Blessing 3 because I think it's a better IEM across the board as long as you're okay with that tonality. Compared to the Hype 4, I do think it's a bit more of an even playing field in terms of the technical performance. The bass of the Blessing 3 is still better than that of the Hype 4. It's more punchy, it's more dynamic. The resolution is just a touch better on the Blessing 3 as well. But in terms of the mid-range performance and tonality, the Hype 4 just has such an advantage there that I start to feel that you can really swing either way. For the treble, I do think that some people find the Blessing 3 to be too bright, while the Hype 4, I'd say it's less bright and just more kind of exaggerated and annoying, and you can really easily fix that with a touch of EQ. Now another IEM that I've seen in the spotlight a bit these days is the Hisenior MkIII EST, and it's because of some of the changes to the measurement standards that we have. The MkIII graphs very similarly to that DF plus 10 slope approximation, which is, as I remind you, is not a target, okay? At any rate, it makes a very good comparison to the Hype 4, which has a very similar frequency response graph. I had a chance to compare the Hype 4 against the MkII side by side, volume matched it, and here are some of my thoughts. The first thing I noticed is that it really showcased the weaknesses of Thieaudio's impact squared drivers that are used in these Hype series IEMs. The hollowness in these drivers really started to show itself, and you can see it on the graph here where the MkII actually has less bass than the Hype 4 does, yet it sounded just as bassy or even more bassy than the Hype 4 did. There was much better control all the way down to the sub bass, while the Hype 4 has that hollowness when you hear the toms or the kick drum, and it just doesn't feel rich or deep or as full as the MkII did. As we roll into the mid-range, I had no issues with any of these IEMs. Both of them are equally as good to me. In my short little listening session, I could not tell you which one I preferred. But it's in treble where I did prefer the Hype 4. And the reason for this is because the MkII EST, in some instruments like the hats and cymbals, it can be oddly peaky and notes feel incomplete or unbalanced. And you don't really hear this on, slower acoustic tracks, but put on some fast metal or rock tracks and it becomes pretty apparent. The Hype 4 on the other hand has its exaggerated quality. It can be somewhat annoying with its, ever-present treble, but at least it does render these notes completely. Now on a technical level, the MkII EST is no slouch here, but when I compare it side by side with the Hype 4, it does fall a little bit behind. I find that the Hype 4 has better note articulation, better definition, and just a little better resolution overall. Now both IEMs are an excellent option for their price brackets, but given that the Hype 4 costs $150 less than the MkII EST does, it is a bit of a better value proposition. Now lastly, let's compare the Hype 10 at $800 versus the Monarch Mark II and Mark III at $1,000. Now full disclaimer, I don't have any of those IEMs with me at the moment, so I can't do a true side-by-side comparison. I'm going off memory here, okay? Overall, I would say that the Hype 10 is more like the Mark II with shades of the Mark III. In terms of bass quality, I think all three IEMs are about the same of one another. The Monarch Mark II and Monarch Mark III doesn't have the best bass of any of the kilobuck IEMs that I would recommend. Just dynamically, it's kinda middling compared to its peers. And while I mentioned that the impact squared drivers on the Hype 2 and Hype 4 aren't very good, on the Hype 10, I find them acceptable, maybe because of the added balance armatures here. Either way, in terms of overall bass presence, I would go to Monarch Mark III, then the Hype 10, then the Monarch Mark II. The Monarch Mark II has the leanest bass response of them all. The Mark III has a bit of that mid-bass heft that's really nice to hear, and the Hype 10 kinda just blends itself between the two. Now in the mid-range, in my written review of the Monarch Mark II versus the Mark III, I actually did prefer the Mark III's mids just by a little bit because I found that coloration gave it a bit of character, made it a little bit distinct. When I compared the Hype 10 to the Monarch Mark II, I would actually take the Mark II's mids because even though the Hype 10 does have a bit of color to it, I didn't find it as pleasant or distinct as the Mark III is. Now as for the treble, the Monarch Mark III is infamous for being very zingy and shimmery and sizzly in its upper treble. It's quite bright up there. I do hear some of that shimmer and sizzle on the Hype 10, but it's nowhere near to that extent. In comparison, the Mark II is definitely the safest and most balanced of the lot. Alright, so that was a lot of words to compare the Hype 10 versus the Monarch Mark II and Mark III. And I'll make it really easy for you. At a high level picture, I prefer the Monarch IEMs. Obviously, this is highly subjective, but I do think that the Monarch Mark II is just more refined than the Hype 10 is. There's a better blending of all its different elements than the Hype 10 does. The Monarch Mark III has much better sheer resolution that Hype 10 cannot hope to match. I think that a Hype 10 is a respectable attempt at blending these two IEMs together. It is $200 cheaper, but I do think that it loses some of its own identity in a process. So in conclusion, the Hype 2 is an okay IEM, but I wouldn't recommend it. It's at a very competitive price point, and I think this IEM has quite a few caveats to it that makes me say, why don't I just pick another IEM? And this is more apparent when the Hype 4 is just right around the corner for $100 more, and I think it does everything the Hype 2 does, but better. It has some of the best mid-range tonality, and I think the Hype 4 is an IEM you should be looking towards if you're coming in from the $50 to $100 mark. You're trying to find what's a reasonable stopping point. The Hype 4 is that reasonable stopping point, provided that you are okay with some of that treble exaggeration, you are not too treble sensitive. And finally, for the Hype 10, this is a good IEM. I can see an argument for people preferring this over the Hype 4, and I think it will have its own following. The only issue for me is that at $800, it is a bit of a hard sell compared to the Hype 4, and it's so close to that kilobuck range that you might as well save a little bit more and then your options open up with the $1,000 mark. Overall, the Hype IEMs are just another page in Thieaudio's history. The Hype 4 is their classic price to performance value option that will shake up the bracket a bit. The Hype 2 will probably be forgotten, and the Hype 10 will find a limited following. These IEMs aren't that revolutionary. The Hype 4 and Hype 10 are good, but if you already have a planar IEM or something like the True Nova that you already really enjoy, I wouldn't rush out to buy the Hype 4. And even if you could buy the Hype 4 or the Hype 10, it's currently only on pre-order. I think there's something like a 4 to 8 week build time at the moment. So by the time they even start shipping, Thieaudio might even have an entirely new lineup of IEMs already. Anyway, that's gonna be it from me. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked it. You can let me know in the comments below. Now, as a reminder, don't forget about the audiophiles, where we have a lot of headphone and IEM related content and other educational resources that don't always make it into a video. Otherwise, have a nice day. And don't forget to subscribe.